In the killing heat of the Kalahari Desert, Dr. Sienna Hayes had 23 seconds to decide which lion to kill. A pregnant lioness was convulsing in the sand, her abdomen torn open from the inside, three unborn cubs suffocating as she bled out, and Sienna stood frozen between two massive male lions who had been trying to murder each other for 8 months. But today, neither was fighting. The scarred pride king who would die defending his mate stood motionless on one side, his amber eyes burning into Sienna's face. The exiled rival who should be pacing, waiting for the moment the lioness stopped breathing so he could slaughter every cub, sat perfectly still on the other side, 40 yards away, watching with an intensity that made Sienna's skin crawl. She had one tranquilizer dart, one emergency blood kit, in a choice that made her want to vomit. Sedate the mate Kyle for his blood, and watch the rival, Ridian, charge in and kill the dying lioness while she was defenseless. Or sedate the rival to eliminate the threat, and watch the lioness die from blood loss before Sienna could even start the transfusion. Either choice meant death. Either choice meant failure. Sienna raised the rifle toward Kale, her finger hovering over the trigger, her breath coming in short gasps. 15 seconds left. The lioness's breathing had stopped. Just stopped. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. Kale made a sound that didn't belong in nature. A broken, keening wail that sounded like a man watching his wife die. And that's when Ridian moved. The exiled lion stood up, and every nerve in Sienna's body screamed at her to run, to get back in the vehicle, to save herself. But Ridian wasn't moving toward the dying lioness. He was moving toward Sienna, walking straight at her with his eyes locked on hers, his scarred muzzle catching the brutal desert light, his massive body closing the distance between them with terrifying speed. 30 yards. 20. Sienna's field assistant was screaming at her to get in the Land Rover. Her finger was frozen on the trigger. 10 yards. 5. Ridian stopped so close that when he exhaled, Sienna felt his breath against her legs. Then this 850-pound apex predator, this exiled killer, who by every law of nature should be ending her life right now, did something that made Sienna's hands go numb. He lay down at her feet, extended his right foreleg, and turned his massive scarred paw upward, exposing the thick vein that pulsed beneath the skin, offering his blood to save the mate of the lion who had destroyed him, offering his blood to save cubs he was biologically programmed to kill. No one in the 140-year history of Kalahari wildlife research had ever seen a rival male do this. Not once. Not ever. And Sienna had 4 seconds to decide. Trust a wild predator who could kill her with one movement, or watch a mother and 3 cubs die in the sand. What she chose in that moment, what happened in the next 9 minutes, and what she discovered when the 3rd cub finally took her first breath and revealed a white crescent mark on her chest that perfectly matched Ridian's own marking, would shatter everything science thought it understood about rival lions, about sacrifice, about the kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on any test humanity has ever designed. Moving slow, before the story begins, tell everyone watching, where are you right now? What city, what country, what time is it where you are? Are you watching this in broad daylight or in the middle of the night when you should be sleeping? Drop a comment. Let us know you're here. Now, the story begins. The sun had barely broken the horizon over the Kalahari Desert when the emergency call came through to the Phoenix headquarters of Wildlife Crisis Response International. The voice on the satellite phone belonged to Tobias Musi, a Botswana wildlife tracker with 38 years of experience navigating the most dangerous territories in southern Africa. His voice carried the kind of controlled panic that only came from witnessing something profoundly wrong. A lioness was down in the disputed borderlands between 2 rival territories. She had been in labor for over 13 hours in temperatures that had already reached 112 degrees. Her mate was standing vigil beside her collapsing body, and the exiled male who had been trying to kill him for the better part of a year was positioned 40 yards away, not attacking, not retreating, just watching with an unnatural stillness that made every instinct in Tobias's body scream danger. Dr. Sienna Hayes was in her cramped office in Scottsdale, Arizona, reviewing necropsy reports from a failed grizzly bear rescue in Yellowstone when the call transferred to her desk. She had spent 14 years working with apex predators on 5 continents, from the Siberian tigers of Russia to the jaguars of the Amazon. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what Tobias described next. The Lioness, a female the Rangers had named Zahara for the scimitar-shaped scar along her right shoulder, was hemorrhaging internally. Her contractions had stopped completely 2 hours ago, which meant the cubs inside her were either dead or minutes away from it. Her mate, a massive dominant male the trackers called Kale, a name that meant warrior in Gaelic, refused to leave her side even as the brutal sun climbed higher. But it was the presence of the second lion that made Sienna's stomach drop. Rydian, the exiled challenger. A younger male Kale had driven from the Pride 8 months earlier after 3 savage territorial battles that left both lions carrying scars they would bear for life. Rydian had a torn ear, a gash across his left shoulder, and a distinctive pattern of claw marks running down his face, all gifts from Kale during their final confrontation. By every rule of lion behavior, by every documented pattern of male aggression and territorial dominance, Rydian should be circling that dying lioness like a vulture, waiting for the moment her heart stopped so he could eliminate Kale's genetic legacy and reclaim the pride. But he wasn't circling. He was sitting, watching, waiting for something Tobias couldn't identify. Sienna made the decision in less than 40 seconds. She would take the next available charter flight to Gaborone, Botswana, then helicopter to the coordinates Tobias transmitted. She called her emergency response team, a trauma veterinarian named Jackson Rivera, who had worked military medicine in Afghanistan before transitioning to wildlife care, and a field researcher named Mira Osei from Ghana, who specialized in large predator behavioral analysis. They would meet her at Mount Airport with a fully equipped mobile surgical unit. 21 hours later, Sienna's boots hit the red Kalahari sand. The heat was immediate and crushing, the kind that made the air shimmer and twist, that turned breathing into labor. Tobias was waiting beside a dust-covered Land Rover, his weathered face creased with lines that spoke of decades spent reading the subtle languages of the wild. He didn't waste time with greetings. He pointed toward a sparse cluster of acacia trees roughly 300 yards to the northeast. That was where Zahara lay dying. That was where Kale maintained his vigil. That was where Rydian waited. Jackson and Mira climbed out of the second vehicle, both already sweating through their field uniforms despite the early hour. Jackson carried the medical pack, tranquilizer rifle, emergency surgical kit, portable oxygen, IV fluids, and the blood transfusion equipment that might be the only thing standing between life and death. Mira had her observation gear, binoculars, telephoto camera, voice recorder. She would document everything, because if this situation went wrong, if lions killed humans or humans were forced to kill lions, there would be investigations, legal proceedings, insurance claims, and international wildlife protection agencies demanding answers. Tobias drove slowly, keeping the engine noise low to avoid triggering defensive responses from either male. As they crested a shallow rise in the terrain, Sienna saw them for the first time. Even from 200 yards away, Kale's presence dominated the landscape. He was enormous, his mane so dark it looked almost black in certain light, his body positioned protectively alongside a pale shape that barely moved. Zahara. Her breathing was visible even at this distance. Rapid, shallow, the kind of respiratory distress that indicated shock, internal bleeding, or both. And 40 yards behind her, perfectly positioned to monitor both the dying lioness and the approaching vehicles, sat Rydian. He was smaller than Kale, his mane less developed, but his body carried a lean, dangerous power. His torn ear was immediately visible, as were the scars Kale had given him. He didn't move as the Land Rovers approached. He simply watched with an intensity that made the hair on Sienna's arm stand up. When they were 70 yards out, Tobias stopped the vehicle. Any closer risked triggering territorial aggression from Kale or opportunistic attack behavior from Rydian. Sienna opened the door slowly, her movements deliberate and non-threatening. The heat slammed into her like a physical force. She could hear Zahara's breathing now, a wet, labored sound that meant fluid in the lungs or blood in the chest cavity. The lioness's eyes were half closed, her tongue visible between her teeth, her body trembling with exhaustion and pain. Sienna studied Kale's posture. The massive lion's head was lowered, his gaze fixed on Zahara's face. He wasn't scanning for threats. He wasn't displaying dominance. He looked exactly like every human Sienna had ever seen keeping vigil beside a dying loved one. Present, helpless, refusing to leave even though staying meant witnessing unbearable suffering. It was a posture that transcended species, that spoke to something fundamental about attachment and loss. Then Sienna made the mistake of looking at Rydian, and her breath caught. The exiled lion wasn't watching Zahara. He was watching Sienna. Their eyes met across 70 yards of desert, and Sienna felt a jolt of recognition she couldn't explain. This lion knew exactly what was happening. He understood that the humans represented intervention, that Sienna's presence meant an attempt to save the dying female. And instead of seeing that as a threat or an opportunity, Rydian was waiting to see what would happen next. Jackson moved up beside Sienna, the tranquilizer rifle already loaded and calibrated. His voice was low and professional, the tone of someone who had made life and death decisions under impossible pressure. Sienna, we need to make a call. Zahara's vitals are crashing. We can see it from here. If we're going to save her, we need blood for a transfusion, which means sedating one of those males. Kyle is the obvious choice. He's the mate, he's larger, he can spare more blood. But sedating him means leaving Zahara completely vulnerable to Rydian during the procedure. Mira was scanning Rydian through binoculars, her voice tight with academic precision, trying to mask deep unease. Rydian's behavior is completely atypical. He should be displaying pre-attack posturing, lowered stance, focused stare on Zahara, incremental approach movements. But he's doing none of that. He's sitting in a neutral observation position. It's like he's waiting for permission. Sienna pulled out the emergency protocol checklist, the same document that had guided her through grizzly attacks in Montana and elephant charges in Tanzania. But none of the scenarios covered this. 2 rival males, 1 dying female, 1 impossible choice. She looked at the tranquilizer rifle in Jackson's hands and felt her stomach twist. If she sedated Kale and Rydian attacked, Zahara would die. If she tried to sedate Rydian first to eliminate the threat, Kale might interpret it as an attack on his rival and charge to defend his territory, which would put the entire team in lethal danger. And if she did nothing, if she stood here calculating probabilities while Zahara's blood pressure dropped and the cubs suffocated, then she had flown 8,000 miles to witness death she could have prevented. Tobias spoke quietly beside her, his eyes on both lions. In my language, we have a saying, Mwalebe obonakadinko. The old one sees with the nose. It means wisdom comes not from what you observe, but from what you sense beneath observation. Those lions are not behaving like enemies today. Something has changed, something we cannot see. Sienna took 3 steps forward, her hands empty and visible. Kael's ears swiveled toward her, his massive head lifted slightly, amber eyes tracking her movement. Sienna raised her palms, the universal gesture of peaceful intent, and spoke even though she knew the lion couldn't understand words. We're here to help her. That's all. Just let us help her. Kyle's body tensed. For a moment, Sienna thought he would charge, thought she had made a fatal miscalculation. But then, with agonizing slowness, Kyle shifted his weight and moved 8 inches to the side. It was the smallest concession, barely enough space for a human to kneel, but it was permission. Sienna turned toward Jackson. Get the tranq rifle ready. I'm going to approach Kale for... She never finished the sentence, because Rydian stood up, and the entire dynamic shattered. The exiled lion rose to his full height, his body coiling with lethal power. Jackson swung the rifle toward him instinctively, finger moving toward the trigger. Mira gasped. Tobias murmured something in Setswana that sounded like a prayer, and Sienna felt every muscle in her body lock with primal fear because Rydian was moving, not toward Zahara, toward Sienna. He walked with the fluid, purposeful gait of an apex predator who had made a decision. Each step covered ground with terrifying efficiency. 40 yards became 30, 30 became 20. Sienna could hear Jackson's breathing accelerate beside her, could hear him whispering urgently, "Sienna, get back in the vehicle. Get back now." But Sienna couldn't move. Her feet felt rooted to the sand, her mind screaming at her to run, while her body refused to obey. Rydian passed within 10 feet of Zahara's dying body, without even glancing at her. He walked directly past Kale, his enemy, his rival. The lion who had scarred his face and exiled him from everything he had known. And Kale didn't attack. The massive lion watched, muscles trembling with tension, but he didn't move. 20 yards. 15. Sienna could see the scars on Rydian's muzzle now, the way his torn ear twisted slightly at the top, the pattern of Kale's claws permanently etched into his face. 10 yards. She could see his eyes, amber and intelligent, and burning with something that looked almost like desperation. 5 yards. She could smell him, the wild scent of sun-baked fur and dust, and something primal her hindbrain recognized as danger. 3 yards. Rydian stopped. So close that when he exhaled, Sienna felt the heat of his breath against her legs. So close she could count the whiskers on his muzzle, could see the way his nostrils flared as he scented her fear. Jackson was shouting now, actually shouting, "Sienna, move! Move now!" But Sienna stood frozen, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat, her vision narrowing to tunnel focus on the 850-pound predator standing within killing distance. And then Rydian did something that made Sienna's knees nearly buckle. He lay down, right there, 3 feet from her boots, on the scorching sand. He lowered his entire body into a position of complete vulnerability, his belly exposed, his throat accessible. Then he extended his right foreleg, stretching it out fully toward Sienna, and turned his massive scarred paw upward. The gesture exposed the vulnerable inner surface of his leg, the place where thick blue veins ran just beneath the tawny skin, the place where a lion would never willingly show weakness to a potential threat. He held the position, perfectly still, his amber eyes locked on Sienna's face with an intensity that felt like communication. Sienna heard her own voice, distant and strange, whisper words she didn't remember choosing. "He's offering his blood." The sentence hung in the superheated air like something from a fever dream. Jackson made a sound that was half laugh, half sob of disbelief. Mira's camera shutter clicked frantically, documenting something that shouldn't exist. Tobias moved up beside Sienna, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent witnessing the impossible. "Que Modimo," he whispered in Setswana. "It is divine. No ranger in the history of this desert has seen a rival male offer blood to save an enemy's mate. This does not happen. This cannot happen, but it is happening." Sienna's medical training fought against her disbelief. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely think, but her mind raced through the logistics. Lion blood transfusions were possible. She had performed them before in controlled clinic environments with sedated donors. But this was different. Rydian was fully conscious, fully capable of killing her if he changed his mind or if pain triggered his defensive instincts. She would have to kneel beside him, insert a needle into his vein, and trust that a wild apex predator would allow her to draw blood for 6 to 8 minutes without attacking. The alternative was watching Zahara die, watching 3 unborn cubs suffocate, flying 8,000 miles to bear witness to preventable death. Sienna looked at Rydian's extended paw, at the scars that marked his exile, at the eyes that held hers with unwavering focus. Then she made a choice that defied every safety protocol, every liability insurance policy, every rational risk assessment she had ever learned. She knelt in the sand beside the lion who should have been her killer. Jackson moved with her, positioning himself at an angle where he could fire the tranquilizer if Rydian showed any sign of aggression. Mira kept filming, her hands trembling but steady enough to capture the moment. Tobias stood perfectly still, his presence a quiet anchor of calm in the chaos of adrenaline and fear. Sienna pulled sterile gloves from her pack, her hands still shaking. She prepared the needle, a large-bore catheter designed for equine medicine, the only size strong enough to penetrate a lion's thick skin. She attached the collection bag, checked the valve, steadied her breathing. Then she reached out slowly, giving Ridian every opportunity to pull away, to change his mind, to remember that she was prey and he was predator. Her fingers touched the fur of his inner foreleg. It was coarse and warm, radiating heat from the desert sun. Ridian flinched slightly but didn't move. Sienna palpated gently, searching for the vein. She could feel it, thick and strong beneath the skin. She positioned the needle, her breath held, her entire world narrowed to this single point of contact between human technology and wild trust. She inserted the needle. Ridian's muscles tensed instantly, a ripple of tension that traveled through his entire body. His head turned slightly toward her, lips pulling back just enough to reveal the edge of massive canines. Jackson's finger moved to the trigger. Sienna froze, the needle halfway inserted, her life balanced on the edge of a lion's tolerance. Then Ridian exhaled, a long, controlled breath that released the tension from his body. He turned his head away from Sienna, looking instead toward where Zahara lay dying, and held perfectly still. Sienna pushed the needle the rest of the way in. Dark red blood began flowing into the collection bag, steady and strong. She counted seconds in her head, the way she had been trained to do during emergencies when time became elastic and unreliable. 10 seconds. 20. The bag began to fill. 30 seconds. 40. Ridian's breathing remained even, his body motionless except for the subtle rise and fall of his ribs. 1 minute, 90 seconds. Sienna could feel sweat running down her spine, soaking through her shirt. The heat was unbearable, but she couldn't move, couldn't adjust position, couldn't do anything that might trigger the lion's defensive instincts. 2 minutes. The bag was 1/4 full. 2.5 minutes. 1/3 full. At 3 minutes, Ridian shifted slightly, and Sienna's heart stopped. But the lion was only adjusting his weight, settling into a more comfortable position for the long stillness required. His eyes remained fixed on Zahara, on the dying lioness who carried cubs that must be his. 4 minutes. The bag was half full. Sienna risked a glance at Ridian's face. The lion's expression was unreadable, but there was something in the set of his jaw, the focus of his gaze, that looked almost like determination. 5 minutes. The bag passed the 3/4 mark. Sienna needed at least 500 milliliters for a viable transfusion. They were close. So close. At 6 minutes and 40 seconds, the bag reached capacity. Sienna carefully withdrew the needle, applying immediate pressure to the puncture site with sterile gauze. Ridian held still for another 15 seconds while she worked, then slowly, deliberately, pulled his foreleg back and stood. He didn't walk away. He moved to a position 20 yards from Zahara, lowered himself to the ground again, and resumed his vigil. The entire exchange had taken less than 7 minutes, but in those 7 minutes, Sienna had witnessed something that would haunt and humble her for the rest of her career. A lion driven by instincts and intelligence humanity barely understood, had chosen cooperation over competition, had chosen to save rather than destroy, and she had been the instrument of that choice, her hands literally connecting the blood of enemies in an act of biological communion. Jackson was beside her instantly, taking the blood bag, preparing it for transfusion. His voice was shaking. "Sienna, I've worked war zones. I've seen soldiers make impossible sacrifices, but I have never seen anything like what you just did." Sienna couldn't respond. Her throat was too tight, her mind too overwhelmed. She just nodded and turned toward Zahara. The lioness was worse than Sienna had feared. Up close, the signs of critical distress were unmistakable. Pale gums indicating severe blood loss. Rapid, shallow breathing indicating shock. Distended abdomen indicating obstructed labor and possible uterine rupture. Her eyes were glazed with pain and exhaustion, barely focusing on the world around her. When Sienna placed her hand gently on Zahara's flank, the lioness barely responded, her body too depleted to react even to the presence of a human. Kyle rumbled deep in his chest, a sound that vibrated through the ground beneath Sienna's knees. But when Tobias approached slowly, speaking in low Setswana, explaining what the humans were trying to do, even though the lion couldn't understand the words, Kale shifted again. Creating space, granting permission through small concessions that added up to enormous trust. Sienna inserted the IV catheter into Zahara's foreleg vein with practiced efficiency. She connected the blood transfusion line and watched as Ridian's blood, rival's blood, enemy's blood, savior's blood, began flowing into Zahara's collapsing circulatory system. It was a sight that defied every textbook, every behavioral study, every documented pattern of lion social dynamics. But it was happening, and it was keeping Zahara alive. While the transfusion continued, Sienna examined Zahara's abdomen. She could feel the shapes of cubs inside, 3 distinct forms, none of them moving. That was the worst possible sign. Healthy cubs moved constantly, shifted position, struggled against the confines of the womb. Stillness meant distress. Stillness meant death was close. Sienna made the hardest call of her career. "We're doing an emergency C-section, right here, right now. There's no time to transport her, and moving her in this condition could kill her." Jackson stared at her. "Sienna, we don't have a sterile environment. We don't have surgical lighting. We don't have backup if something goes catastrophically wrong." Sienna met his eyes. "If we don't do this, she dies. The cubs die. We came here to save lives, so we save them." Mira helped Jackson unpack the surgical kit onto a sterile drape spread across the sand. Scalpels, clamps, sutures, antiseptic solution, emergency medications. Tobias positioned the reflective panel to angle the harsh desert sun onto Zahara's abdomen, creating a makeshift surgical field. It was primitive, dangerous, and completely insane, but it was also the only option left. Sienna scrubbed her hands with antiseptic until her skin burned, pulled on fresh surgical gloves, and took a breath that felt like lifting a mountain. The incision had to be perfect. Too shallow and she wouldn't reach the uterus. Too deep and she could sever the femoral artery or damage internal organs. She positioned the scalpel against Zahara's abdomen, feeling the weight of 3 unborn lives pressing against the blade. She made the first cut. Clean, precise, controlled. Zahara's body twitched weakly, but the sedation held. Blood welled up immediately. Too much blood, which confirmed Sienna's worst fear. Internal hemorrhaging. She worked quickly, using clamps and gauze to control the bleeding, while she deepened the incision through layers of muscle and fascia. Cal made a sound that was part growl, part whimper, his massive body trembling with the effort of restraining his protective instincts. Sienna reached the uterus. It was swollen and dark purple, a dangerous sign indicating oxygen deprivation and tissue damage. She made a second incision into the uterine wall and immediately felt resistance. Something was blocking the birth canal. She reached in carefully, her gloved fingers searching, and found it. A mass of twisted fibrous tissue, thick as rope, pressing against the first cub's skull and preventing any possibility of natural delivery. This was what had been killing Zahara for 13 hours. This was the obstruction that had sentenced her and her cubs to death. Sienna worked it loose with agonizing care, aware that one wrong movement could tear the uterus beyond repair. The tissue came free in one heavy piece, slick with blood and amniotic fluid. She set it aside and immediately felt movement, a cub, still alive. She guided the first cub out gently, a tiny body covered in membrane, limp and silent. Jackson was ready with a towel. He cleared the cub's airway, wiped away the membrane, rubbed the small chest with firm, rhythmic pressure. Nothing. No breath, no sound, no movement. Sienna's heart sank, but Jackson didn't stop. He tilted the cub's head back slightly, ensuring the airway was fully open, and continued chest compressions. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Sienna reached into the uterus for the second cub, trying to work quickly while Jackson fought for the first life. At 45 seconds, a sound broke the desert silence. A thin, rattling squeak. The first cub gasped, coughed, and drew breath. The sound was weak but unmistakable. Life. Jackson's face crumpled with relief as the cub began mewing, tiny lungs filling with air for the first time. It was a male, small and dark-furred, his eyes sealed shut, his body trembling but breathing. Cal's reaction was immediate and profound. His entire body went rigid, head snapping toward the sound of his cub's cry. He made a noise Sienna had never heard from a lion before, a deep, resonant rumble that sounded almost like recognition, almost like joy. Sienna delivered the second cub quickly. This one was larger, stronger. She emerged with a robust cry that filled the air, a healthy female with lungs that worked perfectly, a voice that announced her presence to the desert with unmistakable vitality. 2 cubs. 2 lives saved. But Sienna's hands found a third shape deep in the uterine cavity, smaller than the others. Wedged in a position that suggested she had been there the longest, suffering the most oxygen deprivation, bearing the worst of the obstruction's pressure. Sienna worked carefully, aware that Zahara's blood pressure was still dangerously low despite the transfusion, aware that every additional second increased the risk of maternal death. The third cub emerged last, and Sienna's breath caught in her throat. She was the smallest of the 3, pale gold fur already visible beneath the membrane, and she wasn't breathing. Her tiny body was completely limp, her mouth slightly open, her chest utterly still. Sienna handed her to Jackson, who had just finished securing the first 2 cubs in warming blankets. Jackson took one look at the third cub, and his expression darkened. He cleared her airway, began compressions, tilted her to drain any fluid. 10 seconds, 20, nothing. 30 seconds, 40. The cub's body remained limp, her color fading from pink to gray. Jackson increased the intensity of the compressions, his professional mask slipping to reveal raw desperation. "Come on, little one. Come on!" 50 seconds. 1 minute. Sienna glanced at the cub's tiny chest and saw something that made her freeze. A small white mark, shaped like a crescent moon, positioned right over where the heart should be. It was distinctive, beautiful, and heartbreaking because the heart beneath it wasn't beating. Sienna looked toward Ridian, 20 yards away, still watching. And there, visible even at that distance, was a white crescent mark on Ridian's chest. The same shape, the same size, the same placement. The realization hit Sienna like physical force. This cub wasn't Kale's. She was Ridian's. That was why he had returned. That was why he hadn't attacked. That was why he had offered his blood. Somehow, through scent or instinct or knowledge that transcended human understanding, Ridian had known that one of these cubs carried his genetic legacy, and she was dying. Jackson continued compressions. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Sienna wanted to tell him to stop, wanted to acknowledge that some battles couldn't be won, but she couldn't make her voice work. Tobias was whispering prayers in Setswana. Mira had stopped filming, her camera lowered, tears streaming down her face. At 2 minutes and 20 seconds, when hope had become a weight too heavy to carry, the cub's mouth twitched. It was so slight that Sienna thought she had imagined it. But then the tiny chest shuddered, contracted, and the cub gasped. The sound was almost inaudible, like wind through grass, but it was there. She gasped again, and then she cried, a thin, reedy sound that grew stronger with each breath. Jackson made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He wrapped the cub in a warming blanket, holding her against his chest, his hands trembling. "She's breathing. She's actually breathing." The cub's cries grew louder, more insistent, her tiny legs kicking against the blanket with surprising strength. Sienna looked toward Ridian, and the lion was standing. Not approaching, not threatening, just standing, his entire body tense with focus. His eyes were locked on the bundle in Jackson's arms, on the cub that carried his mark, his blood, his impossible legacy. And in that moment, Sienna understood that what she had witnessed wasn't just animal behavior, it was choice. Conscious, deliberate choice that prioritized survival over vengeance, cooperation over competition, love, if such a word could be applied to lions, over instinct. Sienna turned her attention back to Zahara. The lioness's breathing had stabilized. The transfusion had worked. Her gums were regaining color, her eyes focusing with more clarity. Sienna sutured the uterine incision with meticulous care, then closed the abdominal wall layer by layer, her hands moving with muscle memory while her mind struggled to process everything that had happened in the last 30 minutes. When the final suture was tied and covered with surgical adhesive, Sienna sat back on her heels. Her scrubs were soaked with sweat, blood, and amniotic fluid. Her hands were shaking from adrenaline crash. Her mind felt simultaneously crystal clear and utterly overwhelmed. Jackson placed the three cubs near Zahara's head, and the lioness, weak but conscious, turned her face toward them. She made a soft maternal sound, and the two stronger cubs responded immediately, crawling toward her warmth. But the smallest cub, the one with the crescent mark, turned her head away from Zahara. She turned toward the direction where Rydian stood, and she let out a cry that carried across the desert with surprising volume. Rydian's ears swiveled forward, his entire body leaning toward the sound. The team prepared to transport Zahara and the cubs to the Kalahari Wildlife Medical Center, a facility 80 miles south equipped to handle critical care for large predators. Loading a post-surgical lioness onto a transport stretcher was dangerous under any circumstances, but with Kale watching every movement, the risk multiplied exponentially. Tobias approached Kale with the same steady calm he had maintained throughout the procedure. He spoke in Setswana, his voice low and rhythmic, explaining what needed to happen even though language meant nothing to the lion. But tone mattered. Intent mattered. Trust once given could be honored or shattered by the smallest gesture. Cal watched as the team slid the stretcher beneath Zahara's sedated body and secured her with soft restraints designed not to restrict breathing. He made a questioning sound, deep and uncertain. Tobias kept talking, his hands visible, his movements slow. The team lifted the stretcher and began moving toward the transport vehicle. And Cal stood. He didn't roar. He didn't charge. He simply stood and began walking alongside the stretcher, his massive body pacing beside the humans, carrying his mate, his eyes never leaving Zahara's face. It was the walk of someone following a hospital gurney, someone refusing to be separated even for the journey to emergency care. 20 yards behind them, Rydian stood as well. He didn't approach. He didn't challenge Kale's position. He maintained his distance, his gaze fixed on the smallest cub cradled in Jackson's arms, and he followed. Two lions, rivals who had fought 8 months of brutal territorial battles, now walking in the same direction toward the same goal. It defied logic. It defied biology. It simply was. They loaded Zahara into the climate-controlled transport unit, a custom-built enclosure with oxygen supply and vital sign monitoring. The three cubs were placed in a portable incubator lined with heating pads and wrapped in soft blankets. As the vehicle's engine started, Cal pressed his scarred face against the transport unit's ventilation grate, his breath creating small clouds of condensation. Zahara, despite her sedation and weakness, lifted her head slightly and touched her nose to his through the metal mesh. The gesture was so tender, so unmistakably affectionate, that Sienna felt something break open in her chest. She had spent 14 years studying predators as biological machines, as evolutionary algorithms optimized for survival and reproduction. But what she was witnessing now was something the textbooks didn't cover, something the peer-reviewed journals couldn't quantify. This was devotion. The transport vehicle began moving slowly across the rough desert terrain, and Kale began to walk. He matched the vehicle's pace exactly, his powerful legs carrying him alongside the unit that held his mate and cubs, never falling behind, never rushing ahead, just there, present, faithful. Sienna rode in the passenger seat, watching through the side mirror as the massive lion maintained his position beside them. The desert heat created shimmering waves in the air, making Cal's form ripple like a mirage. But he was real, solid, unwavering. She glanced at the other mirror and saw Rydian. The exiled lion followed 40 yards back, his lean body moving through the heat with fluid grace, maintaining distance, respecting boundaries, but still following, still present, still connected to the tiny life that carried his mark. For 13 miles they drove, the lions keeping pace, and Sienna watched something that felt like witnessing the birth of myth. This was how stories began, she thought. This was how humans thousands of years ago must have looked at the natural world and seen gods, saw intelligence and purpose and meaning woven through everything. At 13 miles, the terrain shifted. Red sand gave way to scrub brush, which gave way to the edge of paved road. The vehicle slowed as they reached the asphalt, and both lions stopped. They stood at the boundary between wild and civilized, as if an invisible line existed that they understood instinctively they should not cross. Kale took 3 more steps, his paws touching the edge of the pavement. The heat radiating from the sun-baked asphalt created visible waves in the air. He tested it, seemed to understand its wrongness, and pulled back. Then he sat heavily in the sand, his massive body settling into a position of waiting. His gaze fixed on the transport vehicle with an intensity that made Sienna's throat tighten. 30 yards behind him, maintaining his respectful distance, Ridian sat as well. The 2 lions, framed against the vast emptiness of the Kalahari, watched as the vehicle carrying Zahara and the cubs pulled away onto the paved road. Tobias, driving, glanced in the rearview mirror and spoke quietly. "They are giving her to us. That is trust beyond measure." Sienna watched through the rear window as the lions grew smaller, became silhouettes against the shimmering heat, then finally disappeared into the distortion of distance and light. But she knew they were still there, still sitting, still waiting, still keeping vigil at the edge of their world, trusting humans to save what they could not. And if you're feeling what Sienna felt in that moment, if this story is grabbing hold of your heart and not letting go, you need to subscribe right now. Because what happens next, what happens when those cubs grow strong enough to return to the wild, is going to absolutely wreck you in the best way possible. Hit that subscribe button because you need to see how this ends. The Kalahari Wildlife Medical Center occupied a converted ranch on the outskirts of Kang, a small village in southwestern Botswana. The facility was modest compared to the massive rehabilitation centers in South Africa, but it was staffed by veterinarians who had chosen this work not for prestige or salary, but because they couldn't imagine doing anything else. When Sienna's transport arrived just after sunset, the medical team was already assembled in the intensive care wing. Dr. Naledi Kumalo, the center's chief veterinarian who had completed her training at Cornell before returning to Botswana, met them at the entrance. She was a tall woman with gray-streaked hair and hands that moved with the confidence of someone who had saved hundreds of lives and mourned the ones she couldn't. She took one look at Zahara's vital signs and immediately began coordinating the transfer to the surgical recovery unit. Zahara was moved to a climate-controlled enclosure with specialized bedding designed to prevent pressure sores and infection. IV lines were established for continued antibiotics, fluids, and pain management. The Lioness was stable but critical, her body exhausted from blood loss and the trauma of emergency surgery performed in desert sand. The 3 cubs were placed in a neonatal incubator unit designed specifically for large carnivore infants. The temperature, humidity, and oxygen levels were precisely calibrated. The 2 stronger cubs, the male and the larger female, adapted immediately. Their cries were strong, their movements vigorous, their suckling reflex intact when offered supplemental formula. But the smallest cub, the one Sienna had privately started calling Themba, the Zulu word for hope, remained worryingly fragile. Dr. Kumalo examined her with gentle thoroughness. Severe prematurity for a lion cub, underdeveloped lungs. She's roughly 15% underweight compared to her siblings. She fought hard to survive that delivery, but she's not out of danger yet. Sienna looked at Themba through the incubator's clear walls. Despite her size, despite her weakness, there was something fierce about her. Her tiny paws flexed with surprising strength. Her ears, still folded and unopened, twitched at every sound. And that white crescent mark on her chest seemed to glow under the incubator's warm light. Jackson, standing beside Sienna, spoke quietly. "That mark. I've been thinking about it. Lion cubs don't have matching birthmarks with adult males unless—" He stopped, the implication hanging between them. Sienna nodded slowly. "Unless they're father and daughter. Ridian didn't offer his blood because he's altruistic. He offered it because somehow he knew one of these cubs was his." The first night was brutal. Zahara's temperature spiked twice, her body fighting infection despite aggressive antibiotic treatment. The medical team had to administer emergency steroids to prevent septic shock. Monitors beeped constantly, tracking heart rate, respiration, blood oxygen levels. Sienna stayed in the observation room, unable to sleep, watching the numbers fluctuate on screens that represented the difference between life and death. The two stronger cubs nursed from supplemental bottles every 3 hours, their tiny bellies growing round, their cries becoming more demanding. But Themba couldn't maintain the suckling strength needed for bottle feeding. Dr. Kumalo had to feed her through a specialized syringe every 90 minutes, a painstaking process that required infinite patience and steady hands. By dawn, Themba had consumed only 70 milliliters of formula, barely half of what she needed to sustain her fragile body. But as the sun rose over the Kalahari, turning the sky from black to deep purple to brilliant orange, something remarkable happened. The perimeter security system alerted the staff to movement at the facility's outer fence. Two large animals had approached the boundary and were now positioned with clear sightlines to the medical building. Sienna walked out to the fence line, her boots crunching on gravel, her coffee forgotten in her hand. And there they were, Kyle and Ridian, separated by approximately 40 yards of neutral space. Both sitting, both watching the building that housed Zahara and the cubs. They weren't attempting to breach the fence. They weren't displaying aggression or distress. They were simply there, maintaining a presence that felt less like stalking and more like vigil. This became the pattern. Every morning, just before sunrise, both lions appeared at the fence. They maintained their positions until the heat of midday drove them to seek shade in a nearby acacia grove. Then, as evening temperatures cooled, they returned, day after day, morning after morning, neither roaring, neither pacing, just waiting. The staff responded with a mixture of unease and wonder. Some argued that having two apex predators maintaining constant surveillance of the facility violated every safety protocol. But others, particularly Tobias and Dr. Kumalo, saw it differently. "They are fathers," Dr. Kumalo said simply, her Nigerian accent softening the words. "Fathers wait. It does not matter if they have 4 legs or 2. On the 4th morning, something changed. Sienna was in the incubator room performing Themba's routine health check when the cub suddenly became agitated. Her tiny body tensed, her sealed eyes moving beneath the lids as if trying to see, and she let out a cry. Not the weak mewling she had been making, but a sharp, clear sound that carried unexpected strength. Sienna checked the monitors immediately. Heart rate elevated but within safe parameters. Respiration normal. Temperature stable. Oxygen saturation good. There was no medical explanation for the sudden distress. Jackson, who was feeding the other 2 cubs, looked up with concern. "What's wrong with her?" Sienna shook her head. "Nothing's wrong. All her vitals are normal, but she's reacting to something." Dr. Kumalo, who had been reviewing charts near the window, spoke quietly. "Sienna, look outside." Sienna walked to the window and felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the warmth of the room. Ridian had just arrived at the fence. The sun was barely above the horizon, casting long shadows across the compound, and Themba, inside a climate-controlled building, with no possible way to see or scent the lion through walls and filtered air, was crying toward the window that faced him. Jackson whispered, "That's impossible. She can't see him. She can't smell him. Her eyes aren't even open yet." Dr. Kumalo, a woman of science who had spent 20 years studying neonatal development in African predators, shook her head slowly. "By every metric we possess, you are correct. It is impossible, but she knows he is there." Over the next 5 days, the pattern repeated with unsettling consistency. Every time Ridian arrived at the fence, Themba became alert, her cries directed toward his location. When Kale's roar echoed across the compound, a sound he made only in the evenings, a deep rumble that carried for miles. Themba would settle, her breathing becoming slow and even, as if the sound itself was a lullaby. The 2 stronger cubs showed no such responses. They ate, slept, and grew according to predictable developmental milestones. But Themba was different. Themba seemed connected to something the staff couldn't measure, couldn't quantify, couldn't explain with their instruments and training. Mira, who had been reviewing hours of footage, called Sienna into the media room on day 6. She had isolated a sequence that made Sienna's scientific worldview crack just a little further. The timestamp showed 3:14 in the morning. Themba was asleep in the incubator. The building was quiet, and then visible through the security cameras. Ridian approached the fence earlier than usual. The exact moment he came into view, before he made any sound, Themba woke. Her head turned toward the window. She cried once, sharp and clear, then settled back into sleep. "Sienna," Mira said quietly, "I've watched this happen 7 times over the past 3 nights. She wakes the moment he arrives. Not 5 minutes after. Not 30 seconds after. The exact moment. How is that possible?" Sienna couldn't answer. She just stared at the screen, watching the impossible unfold frame by frame. By day 10, Zahara had recovered enough to sit upright. Her surgical incisions were healing beautifully, and her appetite had returned with impressive force. The medical team allowed supervised contact between mother and cubs, carefully monitored sessions where Zahara could nuzzle, groom, and bond with her offspring. The reunion was everything Sienna had hoped. Zahara's maternal instincts activated immediately. She cleaned each cub with her rough tongue, memorizing their scent, establishing the biological connection that would define their relationship. The male cub and larger female responded with enthusiastic mewing, crawling over each other to reach their mother's warmth. But when Themba was placed near Zahara, something unexpected happened. The tiny cub crawled not toward her mother's belly for milk, but toward the edge of the enclosure, toward the window, toward the fence line where Ridian waited. Dr. Kumalo gently redirected her, placing her near Zahara's teats, but Themba's head kept turning toward the window, her small body straining in that direction. Sienna discussed the situation with the facility director, a conservation biologist named Marcus Webb, who had worked in wildlife recovery across 3 continents. He was a pragmatic man, skeptical of anthropomorphism, committed to evidence-based decision-making, but even he couldn't dismiss what they were observing. "We've documented orphaned cubs bonding with surrogate mothers," Marcus said, his South African accent clipping the words precisely. "We've documented cross-species adoptions in captivity. We've even documented cases of predators showing unusual tolerance for humans who saved their lives. But a newborn cub recognizing her biological father through barriers that should make recognition impossible? That's operating on levels we don't have instruments to measure." Sienna looked at Themba, now 12 days old, her eyes newly opened and remarkably alert. "Maybe we've been asking the wrong questions. Maybe it's not about recognition. Maybe it's about connection. Something that exists before sight, before conscious memory, before the brain develops enough to process information the way we understand processing." The decision to release Zahara and the cubs came on day 22. Zahara was fully healed, her strength restored to pre-trauma levels. The cubs were thriving, even Themba, who had finally gained enough weight to match her siblings in vigor, if not quite in size. The veterinary team agreed that prolonged captivity would create dependence that could compromise their survival in the wild. The morning of the release, Sienna stood in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the preparation. The transport crates were loaded with the same care that had brought them here. Zahara would be released in a carefully chosen location, neutral territory between Kyle's established range and the borderlands where Ridian had been surviving alone for 8 months. Tobias had selected the site personally, a stretch of grassland near seasonal water sources with sufficient prey population and natural cover. Unclaimed by any pride, it offered Zahara the opportunity to establish herself without immediate territorial conflict. As the sun broke the horizon, painting the desert in shades of amber and gold, the transport vehicles rolled through the main gate, and as they passed the fence line, Sienna saw what she had been both hoping for and dreading. Kyle and Ridian, both standing, both alert, both beginning to move. They followed the vehicles at a distance, their powerful bodies covering ground with efficiency that made human technology seem clumsy. For the entire 80-mile journey, Sienna watched through the mirrors as the 2 lions maintained their pursuit. Sometimes visible, sometimes disappearing into terrain features, but always there, always following. The release site was beautiful in its simplicity. Open grassland bordered by low hills, acacia trees providing shade, the morning light turning everything golden. The team positioned Zahara's transport crate and opened it remotely, stepping back to give the Lioness space and choice. Zahara emerged slowly, her body low and cautious. She sniffed the air, testing for threats and opportunities. Her ears swiveled, processing sounds. And then she saw him, Kyle, standing 70 yards away, his dark mane lifting in the morning breeze. The lioness made a sound, low and resonant, a call that carried across the grassland. Kyle answered, a rumble that Sienna felt in her chest despite the distance. The two lions closed the gap between them, and when they met, it was with a tenderness that transcended species boundaries. Kyle pressed his scarred face against Zahara's neck. She leaned into him, her entire body relaxing for the first time since her ordeal. They stood like that, two beings reunited after shared trauma, and Sienna felt tears streaming down her face without embarrassment. Then Zahara turned back to the transport crate where her cubs waited. She called to them, a mother's summons, and the cubs tumbled out in a chaotic bundle of legs and tails. The male stayed close to Zahara's legs, instinctively seeking protection. The larger female ventured a few wobbly steps, then hurried back to safety. But Themba did something that made every human watching hold their breath. She walked away from Zahara, away from Kale, toward the place where Rydian stood, 50 yards distant, watching. The cub moved with determined instinct, her small legs carrying her across grass that seemed impossibly tall from her perspective. Zahara made a warning sound, sharp with maternal concern, and started after Themba. But then Kale did something extraordinary. He stepped aside, not blocking Zahara's path, but not encouraging her to retrieve the cub either. Just allowing, just permitting something that defied explanation. Themba crossed 40 yards, 30, 20, and Rydian, the lion who by every biological imperative should see this cub as a threat to eliminate or ignore as irrelevant, lowered himself to the ground. He made himself smaller, less threatening, his massive body folding into a position of submission. When Themba reached him, she placed one tiny paw on his scarred nose. Rydian closed his eyes and made a sound Sienna had never heard from a lion. A soft, almost purring rumble that resonated with something that looked unmistakably like peace. Then Zahara walked forward. Not to retrieve Themba, but to stand beside Rydian. She looked at the lion who had offered his blood, who had waited 22 days at a fence, who had followed 80 miles across desert terrain, and she lowered her head and touched her nose to his. It was brief, but it was unmistakable. Recognition, gratitude, acceptance of a truth that biology had written into Themba's cells. Kale approached then, and Sienna's breath stopped. 2 rival males, a female, and 3 cubs. The equation should have ended in violence, in territorial battle, in the brutal mathematics of dominance and survival. But Kale didn't attack. He walked to where Themba stood between Rydian's massive paws, and he too lowered his head. 3 adult lions formed a triangle around the smallest cub, and for a moment it looked less like nature and more like ceremony, like the wild performing a ritual humanity had forgotten it knew. Then Zahara called to her cubs, her voice carrying maternal authority. Themba turned away from Rydian, reluctant but obedient, and followed her mother and siblings toward the grassland. Kyle walked beside Zahara, resuming his role as protector and mate. And Rydian, after a long moment of perfect stillness, stood and began walking in the opposite direction, toward the borderlands. Toward the territory he had claimed in exile, toward the solitary life that was his fate. But before he disappeared into the tall grass, Rydian stopped. He turned back and looked at Themba, at the tiny cub who carried his mark, his blood, his impossible legacy. And Themba, despite her mother's call, despite the distance growing between them, let out one clear, powerful cry. Rydian answered with a roar that shook the morning air, a sound of strength and sorrow, and something that might have been love, if such a word could be applied to lions. Then he was gone, swallowed by grassland, returning to exile. Sienna stood beside the empty transport vehicle, tears streaming freely now, not caring who saw. Jackson had his hand over his mouth, his eyes red. Mira had lowered her camera, understanding that some moments were too sacred to capture. And Tobias, the man who had seen 38 years of the Kalahari secrets, spoke words that would stay with Sienna forever. Sometimes the wild teaches us that love is not something humans invented. We only named it. The lions knew it first. 6 months later, Sienna returned to the Kalahari. She had spent the intervening time writing papers that peer reviewers struggled to accept, giving lectures that left scientists divided between fascination and skepticism, watching Mira's footage go viral with 58 million views and climbing. Wildlife behaviorists from Stanford to Oxford had contacted her, wanting data, wanting explanations, wanting Sienna to quantify what she herself couldn't fully understand. But Sienna had come back not to study, but to witness. Because Tobias had called with news that made the 20-hour flight from Phoenix worthwhile. Zahara's pride had been spotted in the borderlands, the neutral zone between territories. And they weren't alone. Sienna met Tobias at the same coordinates where they had first found Zahara dying. It was evening, the sky turning from blue to violet, the air finally releasing the day's brutal heat. They drove in silence to a rocky outcrop overlooking a waterhole. And there in the fading light, Sienna saw them. Zahara, healthy and powerful, moving with the fluid grace of a lioness in her prime. Kyle, his mane fuller now, his presence still commanding. The three cubs, no longer tiny and helpless, but half-grown and fierce, their play fighting a rehearsal for future survival. The male cub had Kale's build, broad and sturdy. The larger female had Zahara's sleek quickness, and Themba, still the smallest but radiating undeniable vitality, moved with confidence that made Sienna smile. But what stopped Sienna's heart was the fourth lion. Ridian, lying in the shade of an acacia tree 45 yards from where Kale rested. He wasn't part of the pride, not in traditional terms. He maintained his distance, respected boundaries, but he was there, and Kale allowed it. Tobias explained what the Rangers had been documenting. Kale and Ridian had not reconciled in ways humans would recognize. They didn't groom each other. They didn't hunt together. But they had established a détente, an unspoken agreement that this territory, this borderland, was shared space. When young nomadic males approached, threatening the pride, both Kale and Ridian responded. Not fighting side by side, but defending the same ground, the same cubs, the same future, and Themba moved freely between them. She would spend days with Zahara and Kale, learning to hunt, learning pride dynamics. But then she would wander to where Ridian rested, and she would lie in the shade beside him, her white crescent mark visible even from distance, a mirror of his own. Cal watched these interactions but never intervened. It was as if all three lions had reached an understanding that transcended rigid rules of territory and dominance. Sienna watched as the sun set completely, as stars emerged in the vast African sky. She thought about the moment 6 months ago when she had knelt in desert sand, terrified and awed, watching a rival lion offer his blood to save an enemy's mate. She thought about Themba's first breath, about the mark on her chest, about all the impossible things that had somehow become real. "What do you think it means?" Sienna asked Tobias, her voice barely above a whisper. The old tracker was quiet for a long time, his eyes on the lions. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of all his years. "I think it means the world is wider than our understanding. I think it means love and sacrifice and choice are not locked inside human hearts alone. I think when life itself hangs in the balance, even the oldest enemies can become something new. Not friends, not allies, something our words are too small to hold." Sienna nodded, feeling truth settle into her bones. She had spent 14 years studying animal behavior, learning rules, memorizing patterns, and in one day, in one impossible series of choices, all those rules had revealed themselves incomplete. Before leaving the Kalahari, Sienna stood one last time at the fence where Kyle and Ridian had maintained their vigil. The fence was empty now, the lions returned to wild, but Sienna could still feel the weight of those 22 days, the silent presence of two fathers waiting for news they couldn't understand, trusting in something they couldn't name. She thought about people who would watch Mira's footage, who would read her papers, who would try to explain it with science and data. And she hoped some would allow themselves to feel what she felt, the humbling recognition that the universe operated on principles far more complex and beautiful than humanity had yet discovered. Sienna whispered to the empty fence, to the desert wind, to memory, "Thank you. Thank you for the reminder that miracles are real. Thank you for proving love is not human property. Thank you for showing me the impossible becomes possible when the world reveals itself more extraordinary than we dared imagine. And somewhere in the Kalahari borderlands, a young lioness with a white crescent mark lifted her head toward evening sky and roared for the first time, her voice carrying across grassland, announcing to the world that she was here. She was alive. She was the impossible made real. The wild answered back, a chorus of sounds echoing across ancient land for millions of years, a song that would continue long after every human who witnessed this moment returned to dust. But the story would remain, the story of the lion who gave his blood to save his enemy's mate, the story of the cub who knew her father across impossible distances, the story of the day rivals became something more, and nature's rules bent without breaking. If this story moved you, if it changed how you see the world, subscribe to this channel right now. There are more stories like this, more moments where impossible becomes real, more proof the world is stranger and more beautiful than we were taught. Subscribe and come on the next journey. Leave a comment and tell us what you felt. Tell us if you've witnessed something that defied explanation. Tell us if you believe love is bigger than we thought, that sacrifice is written into nature itself, that we are not separate from the wild. We are part of it, and it is part of us. This is the story of Zahara, Kyle, Ridian, and Themba. This is the story of the day the Kalahari witnessed a miracle, and this is the invitation to remember miracles happen every day if only we have eyes to see them. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening, and thank you for believing some stories are worth telling, worth remembering, worth carrying forward into whatever comes next.